So Richard Powell is a specialist in 1 and 2 minute poses, and he was kind enough to record himself drawing some of the Figuary poses that we're going to be drawing and sent them to me with some notes about how he does what he does.
Hi, my name's Kenzo, and this is Love Life Drawing. So here's some of what Richard said. He said knowledge of anatomy is important to create believable forms. So I don't think that means you need to know every muscle and all the Latin names and all that stuff. But just like we talked about before, you want to be able to see the major landmarks, the big structural masses like the rib cage and the pelvis and those kinds of things. He said he looks for the largest forms or lines first and then works to the smaller parts next. And you'll see that he generally starts in the torso, often with the rib cage. He said, I don't worry too much about proportion, but I do tend to elongate the limbs and shrink the head in order to emphasize the fluidity of the form. He also said when he's working from a timed video session, he stops the video if he wants to spend more time, because the goal is to learn, but he keeps his drawings to about 60 to 90 seconds to avoid overworking it. So if he wants to explore further, he'll do another drawing of the same pose. He might pause a 1 minute drawing to add 30 seconds because he feels like he needs that to really get the most out of that pose, but he is not pausing for ages, adding lots of details and finessing things. So I started studying and learning from his demos. Here's how I did that and what I learned.
So at first, I just tried to recreate his drawings step by step. And that was really fun to see how wild he goes with his angles, how much he exaggerates the characteristics of the figure, and how much information he just throws out the window. So often things start in the torso, right? He establishes, there's often a big curve in the torso. And so that's one of the first things that he'll establish. There's the rib cage structure. If the torso kind of comes in and then back out again for the pelvis, he'll really exaggerate that and really bring it in and really bring it out again. The same on the thighs, for example. So thighs, you know, they start off a little bit thicker and they taper off a little bit down to the knee. So what Richard does is he tapers them right off to almost nothing, like the curves are almost touching. And that kind of gives you an indication of what's going on. It's like, what's an essential characteristic of these different components of the figure? Let's take those to an extreme. We've only got a couple of minutes and we really want to put down the essence of what we're seeing. So let's push the big important characteristics and get rid of everything else. And then notice in the thighs, there's a lot you can learn from Richard Powell's thighs, right? Not his thighs, but the thighs that he draws. So, you know, what you want to avoid is symmetrical curves. The figure, our bodies don't really have symmetrical curves. That's not really how our muscles are structured, right? And so you don't want to have curves like this, like two brackets next to each other. And so you might prefer to find curves that kind of flow into each other, or curves that kind of complement each other, right? And he finds curves that complement each other down the thigh and tapers them off to almost nothing at the knee to really exaggerate, you know, the overall movement and flow, right? Because what we're looking for is movement. And when you have something like this, you know, that's what, you know, think of a symbol for movement as like an arrow, and it's like two things coming together. So when your lines are done with boldness, often your lines will have that quality to them, a sort of pointiness to them. And then when your curves are complementary, but when they taper off together, they bring that energy too. So those are things that you can find also in the forearms, right? Our forearms start off thicker and taper off at the wrist. And so he's really exaggerated that tapering. He kind of structures his drawings a lot around the joints. So some artists in their quick gestures, they just, you know, find the movement right through the joints sometimes. You know, they kind of smooth out the joints to find bigger flows. Whereas I think Richard Powell brings out the joints and uses them as like structural endpoints for his big gestural flows. And that's something that I think a lot of artists would find more intuitive.
Maggie, there's a squirrel!
Running, walking the dog, and recording Figuary videos at the same time. When you've got a baby, you've got to be efficient. Oh! I thought, okay, I'm getting this, and then I tried to do it myself with a different pose that he hadn't shown. And that's when I realized the struggle. It was easy for me to copy what he was doing because his drawing became my reference. And I realized that I'm really anchored. I use the reference as like a safety rail, you know? I don't want to depart from the literal truth too much. It kind of reminds me of, you know, if we go to an ice skating rink, which I never go to, but if I did, I would be the guy holding on to the side. And the reference is that railing on the side, and Richard Powell is skating around in the middle, you know, taking risks, having fun, and I'm holding on still. And I struggled to let go of the reference, of the reality, the truth of it. And only in the last pose did I start to feel like I was getting towards the sorts of simplification and exaggeration that he was doing. And I thought that I knew how to simplify and exaggerate, but now I see how far you can take it. And I'm really looking forward in the next few days to pushing further, and I hope that you'll do the same. You don't have to draw exactly like him, but try to simplify down as much as you can the big rib cage shape, the big pelvis shape, exaggerate the angles, exaggerate the tapering of the limbs, and push into simplification and exaggeration. You know, do it with as much passion as Maggie is chasing those squirrels. So this session has quicker poses, like 15-second poses, 30-second poses. Richard Powell's drawings are from 60 seconds to 2 minutes. I found that I actually needed more than 2 minutes because I was studying what he was doing, and it was so unfamiliar, I needed more time. So I paused the interesting poses and took my time to try and learn what he was doing. So I also did these poses in the time limits. So I kind of did them, you know, a few times each, because I did them within the time limits because it's a really good exercise to loosen up and be spontaneous because there's no time. And then also took a little bit more time to learn how to simplify things down the way that he does. But if you don't have much time for today's practice session, just do the poses in the time limits, keeping the general principles of what we talk about here in mind, but don't worry if you can't like reproduce what he does in those short time frames.